Thank you so much for so much. In order to help us clarify and perhaps understand some of the muchness of what we've just heard, it has been my privilege to have our President, Professor Arnold Di Meyer, and Professor James Tsang, the Dean of Social Sciences at this university, to participate in a panel discussion. So could I please invite you to come and take your seats? Thank you. We have heard a scintillating analysis of what goes wrong when the task of education forfeits one of its primary roles, and that is to inculcate a sense of citizenship. I want to begin by perhaps asking Professor Arnold Di Meyer, in terms of your own thoughts on where university education stands, in what ways do you think we can, in a practical way, try and implement some of the thoughts that Lord Elton has shared with us?
It's always difficult to answer a question like that because I probably will make some commitments here then. So I take the right to review my opinions later on. But as I already said in my introduction, I sometimes think that universities have worldwide, and I'm not talking necessarily about universities here in Singapore, but suffer from three problems which have a bit to do with the massification of universities. So universities used to be very elite, and I don't mean elite in terms of higher social classes, although there was a part to that, but an elite type of education. For good reasons, because we believe in the value of education to make or to render a society more prosperous. For good reasons, governments all over the world have invested in higher education. This week, The Economist is a bit doubting that. There's an interesting dossier in The Economist asking some questions about it. But generally speaking, we all believe in the value of education, and thus we have massified education. But as a consequence, there are sort of three elements that universities suffer from. That is, first of all, perhaps in their education we are thinking too much about what is the job we are going to get. And I must say that SMU graduates suffer a little bit from that. They're sort of constantly looking for what are the jobs, how many job offers will I get, what is the best job I get. And of course we need to go in that direction. We do prepare people for a professional environment, but we shouldn't go overboard. We shouldn't see the role of the university only as a preparation for a job. It's something that we actually can't do even, because as I often say to many people, 50% of the jobs that exist today didn't exist 10 years ago. How do we really know what the jobs in 10 years from now will be, and thus how can we prepare you for those jobs? And so, first point that I want to make is that I'm actually believing in a broader education. Of course we need to know the basics and we need to know our disciplines, and it's always a bit of a trade-off, but I do believe strongly in a broader education where people have the opportunity, where students have the opportunity to learn more than about their job and about their field and their discipline, but see the context in which they will actually start working, see also how they can keep on learning. The second thing that we probably suffer from worldwide in universities is that we may have become a bit, and this is less so in Singapore, but when I look at the United Kingdom actually, or the United States, we see the commercialization of the university. The university is a business. And while again, I always say that the university needs to be run efficiently and in a tight way, and that we need to make sure that we use taxpayers' monies and the tuition fees paid by the students in the best way possible, we shouldn't become a business. We are also a social good to society. We have a role in furthering, enhancing society, to be sometimes the conscience of society. And so when we become too commercial as universities, and I don't know more about other education, that's the field I know, is higher education. When we become too commercial, we may sometimes forget these other roles that universities have to play and the other ways we should spend sometimes the resources that we have. The third problem with universities, which is perhaps a more recent challenge, is that universities often were seen as ivory towers. They actually were conceived as ivory towers. Our universities are built on the German von Humboldt Universität that then was brought to Cambridge and Oxford by Prince Albert, the Prince Consort of Queen Victoria. And then from that basis in Cambridge and Oxford was spread to the United States, and from the United States all over the world, as research universities which are rather disconnected from society, where you keep academic integrity but also academic freedom, and where you can think freely about things in the long term. But obviously there is a lot more discussion today about how do we connect universities back to society. Maybe we went a little bit too far in that ivory tower approach. In our research, sometimes we didn't ask the question about why do we do this research and what's going to be the impact of that research. And so I could go on forever, but I know that that's not the point of tonight. But when you look at these three things, think about ensuring that we prepare people not for a job but for a life in society. That secondly, as a university we have an important role to play, more than being a business where you sell a degree and thus somebody pays for getting a number of classes, but where there is a societal role. And thirdly, where we have actually a responsibility, come back to one of your R's, where we come back to the responsibility of a university that works with tuition fees and taxpayers' money to make sure that we are relevant to society. I think that comes in very close to getting respect from society for universities. Yes, we do have some rights as universities in terms of academic pursuit, but we have a lot of responsibilities. And that's sort of my reaction to your question.
Thank you so much.
I actually should add one phrase to it. That is that, or not two phrases, that is that practically speaking then, because I gave you sort of a more theoretical approach, but practically speaking for SMU, we do actually work quite hard on how can we align our research with what the needs of Singapore are all about. Secondly, I do strongly believe in infusing our programs a little bit more with humanities. Not that we become a humanities university, but that we can infuse a lot of our programs with contextual knowledge about history, about culture of this region. And I do believe that we all will become better change agents, or our students will all become better change agents and better leaders if they have that contextual knowledge. And thirdly, as I mentioned already in my introduction, I do believe very strongly in diversity and inclusion, treating people or creating an environment for people in which they will be able to show the best of themselves. So we translate that in practical things at SMU.
Thank you. Thank you, Arno. I'm going to ask Professor Tang a question, but in the meantime, could those of you who have questions to ask perhaps come to the mics that are on the aisles? I know we have a lot of educators in the audience today and a lot of young people, and it'd be fascinating to hear from the young as well. James, we talked about reconfiguring the 3 R's, and Lord Elton has given us one formula: respect, rights, and responsibilities. What's your response to this new sort of reconfiguration?
Well, perhaps I would, in a way, pick up from our President's remark, engaging with some of what you said earlier on, Lord Elton. And that is in particular the broader basis for education for citizens, which to me in a way is really part of what we try to do a bit here at SMU, right, in terms of broadening of our curriculum. And now we are in the process of thinking about to what extent we could strengthen, for example, our humanities and social sciences. Arnold was saying whenever he makes some remarks, there might be an indication that might lead to certain perceptions about commitment. So I was actually just about to sort of propose, 10 professorships in the social sciences to help with engaging with what Lord Elton said. But more seriously, I actually want to sort of raise two questions. The first one is really for the kind of societies we're in now, facing the kind of needs, highly sophisticated knowledge society, very specialized skills are very often required. It's getting more and more competitive. To what extent people or students in institutions of higher learning could be expected to be engaged with the kind of questions that you just presented, important as they are, right? At a different forum recently about humanities as part of management education, I referred to an article I read in the Wall Street Journal with the eye-catching title of "Would You Hire Socrates?" You mentioned Socrates in your presentation. And this is an article written by a philosopher who cited a study in the United States surveying 3 million people about the education, the relationship between education and their income. And what they found was that those at the so-called peak earning ages, that is 56 to 70. I don't know how many of you are in that range. I think the majority here probably not, but there are some. And these people, and they look at what were their undergraduate majors. And what the studies suggested that those who majored as undergraduates in the humanities or social sciences earned annually on average 2,000 more than those who majored as undergraduates in so-called professional or pre-professional fields. Mind you, this is the United States. So a lot of students, of course, after finishing a liberal arts degree, go on to do professional programs. So, that might sort of, might not be as straightforward as what we want to interpret it. But then, the author said, well, but maybe the main thing is really not about income. This should not be the compelling reason for doing humanities and looking at issues like rights, responsibility, and some of these really important things that you highlighted. But still, I think this question that I have in mind, and you look at enrollment in some of these humanities programs, in the top universities around the world, there seems to be less sort of, there's still considerable interest, but it's not quite the same compared to, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago. So how do you look at this sort of situation when this current generation of students seems to be less interested in engaging with that sort of disciplines which traditionally provide, I think, the kind of analysis and learning that inform citizenship. The second question, again, picking up from Arnold's remarks in a way, is the changing nature of jobs, right, moving forward. And things are changing so quickly all the time. And, this remark about, say, 40%, 50% of whatever jobs, best jobs in the next 20 years have not even been invented now. And as an educator, and thinking about these problems, how do we address that issue, right? in the earlier days, right, in universities like Oxbridge, the all-rounded person was supposed to do grades, right, the classics. And that later on, the PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics. How do you see things moving forward for universities in terms of, educating the young beyond just employment? Even employment is important, but also something that is both, meeting that need of society in terms of work and jobs, and at the same time, reflecting on these problems that you outlined and making them into citizens, as you said, that could reflect on decisions that let them understand themselves as well as the nation and the world. These are the two questions. Thank you.
Yeah. David? Sorry, thanks.
Well, if you were to hire Socrates, it would probably be a good idea to hire Archimedes as well, in order so that you can bring those talents and skills together. I think we all need to be educated for citizenship. I hope that was the general thrust of what I was saying. And whether you come into a school of management and business, or whether you're coming to study the greats, I never really did understand why people going to Oxford or Cambridge, as two of my own children have done, but one has read astrophysics, the other theology and philosophy, but then to move on to the law. And when she said to me, I'm interested in the law, but I'm also interested in politics and these things, I said, well, then don't read PPE, and certainly don't read greats. Read things that interest you and get a fine mind so that you'll be able to discern, and then you can work out as a philosopher and theologian what it is you want to do next. So I think we compartmentalize people too soon and too quickly and tell them, go and be this or that, and that's the only thing you should study. And they didn't then halfway through a degree course discover that actually it holds very little interest to them anyway. And the cost involved, and I so much agree with what the President said before, when I was a student, only 9% of the population went on into university or higher education. Today it's around 50% in the UK. In my own city of Liverpool, where I went as a student, only 2% went into higher education. It's around 20% today. And that's because, of course, it's a more disadvantaged and a less economically prosperous area than many other parts of the country. I was the first from either side of my family who'd ever gone into higher education and was a beneficiary of the 1944 Education Act. Now, I really value the grant system that I had, which is why I voted against, as I said, as an independent, but nevertheless I have a vote in the upper house, and I voted against the student loans and the commercialization of our higher education sector, because for me it is more than running a business. And again, I entirely agree with you about this. I worry about the millstones that we place around students' necks, the indebtedness that they have even before they complete their studies, especially when they find halfway through their studies that this was the wrong degree for them anyway, and it's not giving them any sense of fulfillment. So I would like to see us recast the way that we go about higher education, so that we don't tell everybody that the only thing that they need to do in their life is to go into a university. Let's be clear about it, that you're not a failure because you don't go into university. Too much of education, I think, is about the reinforcement of failure, telling people what they're no good at, rather than telling them what they are good at and finding what their skills and talents are. Not everybody has to come to a university. So if all you're going to do is give them a lot of debt and force them into failing because it wasn't right for them, then I don't think you've done particularly any great deal of good. So I would want to think more about that. And yes, learning about how the drains worked in ancient Rome doesn't necessarily provide you with the necessary education for doing what you're going to do in your life, or PPE for that matter. I think you have to find what is right for you and be fulfilled in that. Cultivate a love of learning throughout the whole of your life. When I decided to stand down from the House of Commons, I went up to the University of St Andrews for a year and did a peripatetic fellowship, which meant travelling backwards and forwards. I wanted to embark on philosophy and theology because I'd never been able to study that in my life, and yet I thought, here's a rare window where, with the agreement of my wife and family, and I was able to fit it in with that moment of change in my own career. I think we should always look for opportunities in our lives to cultivate learning. The internet can be a negative force. Yes, I described one or two ways, but when I visited Turkana up in the west part of Kenya, on the borders with South Sudan and Ethiopia, a couple of years ago. I was staying in an outpost in the middle of nowhere, in a really desolate part of the world, and yet there was an electricity supply generated by solar panels, and they had an internet connection, and there were people learning there who were jumping all the barriers that would have otherwise been placed in their path. And some of them were able then subsequently, through some self-learning, but also some assisted learning, to go on to university in Nairobi afterwards. So there are also modern ways of educating, I think, are radically changing, but it can be for the bad as well. I was recently talking to a Muslim friend of mine who is a grandfather despairing about some of the, not his own grandchildren, but grandchildren of his friends who have been radicalized over the internet by jihadists, encouraging them to go to fight in Syria. Now, that's not a solution for those young people, and it's not a solution for Syria, but traditional forms of education where 3 girls had had the opportunity and were doing well in their studies have been drawn away from that by other influences. So we have to work out how we get the balance I talked about earlier on back into our education, how we use the tools that we've been given, but in a productive and constructive way, not by trying to close it all down, but by looking at ways of providing people with understanding of self-knowledge, the judgment that I mentioned earlier on.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for being so patient. Yes. Identify yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. My name is Dhruv Angrish. I'm a student at UWC Southeast Asia, the East Campus. My question is primarily addressed to Lord Alton. Earlier, I refer you to earlier in your speech in the section about respect when you were you cited examples of the man who was arrested in Indonesia for expressing atheist views and the incident in Paris where freedom of speech was defended as a right, which then descended into derogatory remarks and offensive cartooning. Also referred you to your Chesterton quote, which I may paraphrase, that the right to do something does not necessarily make it right to do so. How would you, in light of this, and in light of your remark about how that African proverb that you need the whole tribe in order to educate one boy or one child, how would you propose that including multiple viewpoints in an education, or in the education of the same singular individual, without holding certain viewpoints and certain opinions over others? How would you include all of that while still keeping the same respect and still upholding the same rights?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it's about cultivating a way of learning to live together. For me, that's one of the great challenges in our world today. How do we learn to live together, respecting diversity, respecting difference? If you deride someone else's beliefs and do it in a way that is bound to cause deep offense, then one mustn't be surprised when there is a response. And however reprehensible it is for anyone to, in a violent manner, in a lethal manner, in the case of what happened in the Charlie Hebdo case in France, completely unacceptable for people obviously to behave in that way, but at least enter the mindset of those who felt deeply offended and ask yourself, is this a reasonable use of my freedom to provoke people in such a manner? And so that is why I say that I think all rights carry responsibilities, and we have to balance the rights that we cherish by the use of those responsibilities. Now, then moving on to the position of the state, because I gave you the example of the young man who used the internet to say that he didn't believe in God. Well, I would go to the stake for his right to say that. I don't share his view as it happens, but I would defend his view to say it. I'm appalled to see a young man being publicly flogged on a week-by-week basis in Saudi Arabia, for instance, and now facing a potential death penalty because he too spoke out and said he didn't believe in God. Now again, I don't agree with him, but I would defend his right to hold those views, and his right simply to say that that was his belief was not ridiculing other people's belief, and that is where the line is drawn for me in the sand, a very clear line. He wasn't ridiculing other people's beliefs. Now what does this point to me? It points to dialogue. It points to learning to hear the other person's point of view, learning to respect the other point of view. To someone who's never been inside a mosque, for instance, or learnt to communicate with their Muslim brothers and sisters, I'd say it's about time you did. To those who've never been into a Hindu temple, to those who have never heard about Sikhism, to those who have never bothered to hear about life as a Jew, and what it means to embrace the Torah, to go into a synagogue, or for those who have never been inside a Christian church. It's about time you did, because billions of people hold these views. And even if you're an atheist, then you have a duty to at least reach out and understand that. And those who have religious belief have a duty also to understand atheism as well. So it's cultivating respect, learning about difference and diversity. And I gave the example from my own country of Ireland. You think about the atrocities that occurred in Northern Ireland, the differences between Unionists on one hand, Loyalists as they're sometimes called, Nationalist Republicans on the other. And I think back to the horrors of the so-called Troubles. Even the day after I was elected to the House of Commons, a Member of Parliament was blown up in the precincts of the House of Commons by the IRA, the Republican group, paramilitary wing of the IRA. And I think then over the years that followed, and how it was that we moved to a political process, it didn't begin by putting a lot of political proposals on the table. It began by people standing in the other man's shoes, learning about the other man, meeting the other man regularly, behind the scenes, talking, finding out what it is that really divided, finding what the common ground was as well, and so much united. If you'd said to me at the beginning of that process, I would one day see the Reverend Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, one the Loyalist leader, the other the leader of Sinn Féin, sitting together, forming an administration together in Northern Ireland, I wouldn't have believed you. If you told me before 1989 that I would see the fall of the Berlin Wall, I wouldn't have believed you. I travelled in most of the former Soviet Union. When I made my first maiden speech in my student union, roughly your sort of age, it was against apartheid, and it was in favour of demonstrations on our campus against a visiting rugby team from South Africa, because it was an apartheid. Is that all right? I'm not inciting anybody. It was because I believed that we need to bring about change in a peaceful, non-violent way. And I re-emphasize that, in a peaceful, non-violent way. So I think there are moments to speak out, and you have to try and bring about change. And there are ways of doing that, but it is respectful. And we have to surely find substitutes for what we're seeing all over the world today, and which are disfiguring whole societies, destroying communities, killing people, and leaving widows, leaving children without parents.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you